Within hours, Uganda's post-election tension turned into a security operation. Reports describe power being cut at an opposition leader's home, an electric fence destroyed, private guards assaulted, and a helicopter hovering as he was taken to an unknown location. Ibrahim Traoré is cited as demanding an immediate release, warning that detention before a winner is announced can poison the entire process. If an election can be steered in the dark, what does that say about democracy's next chapter across the region and about who pays the price when institutions hesitate? The promise of this account is straightforward: to map what is known, separate claims from implications, and explain why this moment carries weight beyond a single individual. At stake is not only the fate of an opposition figure, but the credibility of an electoral process unfolding under visible military pressure. The situation raises three linked risks: escalation inside Uganda, normalization of force during political transitions, and spillover effects across a region already sensitive to coups and contested mandates. From the perspective voiced by Ibrahim Traoré, the concern is framed as preventive rather than rhetorical. Detention before results are finalized changes incentives for all actors, including electoral bodies, security forces, and citizens waiting for closure. Even if outcomes are later defended as legal, the sequence of events reshapes trust in advance. This is why the story matters now, not after announcements are made or statements are issued. Once legitimacy fractures, repairing it becomes slower than breaking it. The first detail that shifted attention from routine post-election tension to a deeper concern was timing. According to accounts circulating from opposition sources, surveillance around the residence intensified immediately after campaign activities ended before any final declaration by the electoral body. Power cuts, damage to perimeter defenses, and the reported arrival of a military helicopter did not occur days later as a response to unrest, but while results were still being compiled. That sequence matters because it places coercive action ahead of institutional closure rather than after it. From there, the background becomes clear but also narrower. The opposition leader had already challenged the credibility of announced tallies, arguing that figures being released did not reflect what supporters observed at polling stations. At the same time, the Electoral Commission had publicly stated a specific date for announcing a winner, creating a defined window of uncertainty. It was inside that window that the detention reportedly happened. The immediate effect was informational. Supporters lost contact, statements were replaced by speculation, and verification became harder precisely when transparency was most needed. This is the point at which Ibrahim Traoré entered the narrative. His reaction, as presented in the source material, framed the detention not simply as an internal Ugandan dispute, but as a pattern recognizable elsewhere on the continent. The emphasis was on sequence rather than verdict. Removing a leading challenger before results are finalized alters outcomes regardless of what numbers eventually say. In that framing, legality becomes secondary to leverage. The broader context reinforces why this mini-reveal resonated. Across the region, recent political crises have often hinged less on vote counts than on who controls the transition moment between voting and certification. By compressing action into that narrow gap, authorities can claim order while opponents argue coercion. What looks procedural on paper becomes destabilizing in practice, because trust is eroded before it can be affirmed. The tension, once introduced, does not easily dissipate. The early impact of the detention is best understood through those closest to the scene rather than through official statements. Private security guards stationed at the residence were reportedly assaulted while carrying out routine duties, an action that immediately shifted the episode from political contestation to physical coercion. Electricity cuts and damage to protective infrastructure did more than facilitate an operation in darkness. They sent a message to neighbors, supporters, and local communities that normal rules were suspended, at least temporarily. For residents in the surrounding area, the sight of a helicopter hovering over a civilian compound was not symbolic. It was disruptive, loud, and unmistakable. Such visibility matters because it turns a targeted action into a public signal. People do not need legal explanations to interpret that signal. They read it as power being exercised without mediation, and they adjust their behavior accordingly, often by withdrawing from public expression or contact. This chilling effect unfolds quickly, long before courts or commissions can respond. In the framing associated with Ibrahim Traoré, this early-stage impact is precisely where long-term damage begins. The issue is not whether an arrest can later be justified, but how fear and uncertainty spread in the hours immediately following the action. When communication lines are cut and access is restricted, rumors fill the vacuum. Each rumor, regardless of accuracy, increases anxiety and reduces confidence in formal channels. The consequence is cumulative. Supporters hesitate, observers speculate, and institutions are forced to operate in an atmosphere already shaped by distrust. At that point, even neutral procedures struggle to regain authority. The initial action does not need to be repeated. Its effects continue on their own, shaping expectations and narrowing options for de-escalation. So what begins as a single operation quickly becomes a shared psychological event, one that redefines the political environment before any official outcome is declared. The sequence of events, as presented in the source narrative, follows a clear arc that moves from activation to climax and then to aftershock. Activation began with heightened surveillance after campaign activities concluded. Reports describe drones monitoring the residents continuously, signaling that attention had shifted from electoral messaging to containment. This stage did not yet involve force, but it established pressure and narrowed space for movement, creating a sense that escalation was imminent rather than hypothetical. The climax arrived abruptly. Electricity was reportedly cut, perimeter defenses damaged, and private guards assaulted. These actions compress multiple coercive steps into a short time frame, removing layers of visibility and resistance at once. The reported use of a military helicopter intensified the moment, transforming what could have been framed as an arrest into an operation with unmistakable military characteristics. Timing again mattered. This occurred while electoral results were still being compiled, not after a declaration, making the act inseparable from the political process itself. From this point, aftershock spread outward. Supporters lost direct access to their leader, opposition communication stalled, and speculation replaced verified information. The narrative emphasizes that this vacuum is not incidental. It reshapes perception, allowing authority to control tempo while others react defensively. In this framing, control of time becomes as important as control of force. Ibrahim Traoré's intervention is positioned within this aftershock phase. His call for immediate release reframed the episode as a continental warning rather than a domestic dispute. The argument presented is that detaining a leading challenger before results are announced predetermines outcomes, regardless of later legal explanations. Once leverage is established through force, subsequent procedures operate under constraint. The longer ripple extends beyond Uganda. Regional observers, already sensitive to contested transitions, read the episode as another data point in a pattern. Each repetition lowers the threshold for acceptance elsewhere. What began as a localized operation thus feeds into a broader narrative about how power is secured during uncertainty, and about how quickly democratic rituals can be overtaken by security logic. Quantitative details in this case are limited, but the few that are cited carry disproportionate weight because of when they appear in the sequence. One figure repeatedly referenced is the reported number of fatalities during the post-election period. Opposition-linked accounts state that 10 people had died amid unrest while results were still being compiled. Even without independent verification, the presence of a concrete number changes how events are perceived. It anchors fear to scale, suggesting that the political dispute had already crossed into lethal territory before institutional processes concluded. A second measurable element is temporal rather than numerical. The Electoral Commission had announced a specific date for declaring a winner, creating a known countdown. The detention reportedly occurred before that date, inside a narrow window of uncertainty. This before-after contrast functions like a metric. Before the announcement, all outcomes remain formally possible. After it, authority can claim closure. Acting before that line is crossed shifts leverage decisively, regardless of what is later declared. The timing itself becomes evidence of intent. A third data point concerns deployment intensity. Accounts describe continuous drone surveillance and the involvement of an army helicopter. While no fleet numbers or operational logs are provided, the distinction between routine police presence and military assets is itself a qualitative threshold. Military hardware is not neutral in civilian politics. Its appearance signals escalation, and escalation can be tracked not by quantity, but by category. Crossing from civilian law enforcement to military visibility marks a measurable shift in posture. In the framing attributed to Ibrahim Traoré, these limited metrics are enough to establish a pattern. The argument does not rely on exhaustive statistics, but on deltas. Conditions before the detention included contested results and political tension. Conditions after included loss of contact, fear, and regional alarm. The change is the evidence. Even if later investigations are just figures or reinterpret events, the initial swing in conditions cannot be undone. This approach mirrors how early warning systems often work. They do not wait for full datasets. They flag sharp changes in behavior, timing, and force. In that sense, the numbers here are less about precision and more about trajectory. A handful of deaths, a known announcement date, and the sudden use of military assets combine to indicate acceleration. Once acceleration is established, downstream effects follow predictably. Citizens recalibrate risk, institutions slow, and narratives harden. Quantitative certainty may come later, but by then the political environment has already shifted. That is why, in this account, limited figures are treated not as gaps, but as signals. One counter-argument raised in situations like this is procedural. Authorities may claim that detention is lawful, preventive, or necessary to maintain order, while sensitive results are finalized. From this view, security forces are portrayed as neutral actors responding to intelligence about potential unrest, not as political instruments. If an opposition leader challenges results publicly, the argument goes temporary restriction can be justified to prevent violence and protect institutions until legal channels resolve disputes. A second opposing argument focuses on sovereignty. External voices, especially from other African states, are sometimes accused of interference when they comment on domestic political crises. Supporters of this position argue that each country has its own constitutional framework and security realities, and that public pressure from outside risks inflaming tensions rather than calming them. In this framing, silence is presented as respect and criticism as destabilization. The response offered in the source narrative directly addresses both claims. On procedure, the emphasis is not on whether detention can be legalized after the fact, but on sequencing. Removing a leading challenger before results are announced alters incentives regardless of legal justifications. Preventive action, when taken at the most uncertain moment, ceases to be neutral because it shapes outcomes in advance. Order imposed too early becomes indistinguishable from control. On sovereignty, the reply reframes the issue as precedent rather than intrusion. When similar patterns repeat across borders, they stop being purely internal. Ibrahim Traoré's intervention is presented as rooted in shared continental experience, where delayed responses to early warning signs have often preceded deeper crises. Speaking early is depicted not as interference, but as risk signaling. Together, these rebuttals rest on evidence drawn from timing, method, and impact rather than from intent. The question is not what authorities say they meant to do, but what their actions predictably caused. When fear spreads, communication collapses, and legitimacy erodes before certification, procedural defenses lose force. The Steelman arguments acknowledge genuine security concerns and national autonomy. The counter-response does not dismiss them outright. Instead, it argues that in fragile transitions, restraint matters more than justification, and that the cost of early coercion consistently outweighs its claimed benefits. The midpoint revealed in this account is not a new allegation, but a shift in interpretation. What initially appeared as an isolated detention begins to look like a move to control the transition moment itself. The key detail is that custody reportedly coincides with the period when the electoral body is still compiling and releasing results in stages. That overlap reframes the episode. It suggests that the objective may not be punishment or investigation, but timing. If a challenger is absent during certification, every subsequent step changes character. Statements cannot be issued freely, legal options narrow, and supporters are left guessing. Even if release comes later, the critical window has already closed. The process moves forward without one of its central actors. In effect, the board is reset while one piece is off the table. This is where the warning attributed to Ibrahim Traoré gains force. The focus is not on Uganda alone, but on a repeatable tactic that exploits uncertainty. Elections are rarely overturned on voting day. They are decided in the quiet space between voting and validation. Control that space and outcomes become manageable. The reveal is simple but unsettling. Legitimacy can be redirected without changing a single ballot. Power moved before the count ended. The practical consequences of this episode unfold across several layers, starting with the state itself. For institutions charged with managing elections, the detention introduces pressure at the worst possible moment. Electoral bodies are expected to certify results, while one major political actor is absent and unable to contest procedures in real time. Even if formal timelines are followed, the perception of imbalance lingers. Courts, commissions, and oversight mechanisms must operate under the shadow of force already applied, which weakens their ability to restore confidence afterward. Businesses experience a different but related effect. Political uncertainty translates quickly into economic hesitation. When helicopters, drones, and military units appear in an electoral dispute, investors and local enterprises reassess risk. Decisions are delayed, transactions slow, and contingency planning replaces expansion. The signal is not about ideology, but stability. Once stability is questioned, capital becomes cautious, and that caution can persist long after the political episode fades from headlines. For ordinary citizens, the impact is immediate and personal. Fear of association rises, communication becomes guarded, and participation retreats into private spaces. Supporters of the detained leader may avoid gatherings or online expression, while others disengage entirely to minimize risk. In this environment, political choice narrows not because laws change, but because perceived cost increases. Ibrahim Traoré's framing emphasizes this human layer, arguing that democracy erodes fastest when people self-censor before being told to do so. At the regional level, the implications widen further. Neighboring states and regional bodies observe patterns, not just outcomes. Each instance in which force precedes certification lowers the threshold for similar actions elsewhere. The concern is cumulative. One case becomes precedent becomes expectation, and expectation reshapes behavior across borders. Even countries not directly involved adjust their calculations about how transitions can be managed. Taken together, these consequences illustrate why the episode cannot be treated as a closed domestic matter. The state faces institutional strain, the economy absorbs uncertainty, citizens recalibrate participation, and the region absorbs another signal about how power is contested. None of these effects depend on the final result alone. They are already in motion, driven by the sequence rather than the verdict. Looking ahead 6 to 12 months, three broad scenarios emerge, each shaped less by rhetoric than by how institutions respond after this moment. In a base scenario, formal procedures continue and a winner is announced on schedule. The detained opposition leader is eventually released or granted limited access to legal channels. On paper, the transition appears intact, yet the after effects persist. Trust remains thin, participation cools, and political life settles into a guarded equilibrium. Stability exists, but it is procedural rather than confident, maintained by compliance instead of consent. An optimistic scenario depends on de-escalation. Transparency measures expand, communication channels reopen, and opposition actors regain space to contest outcomes through courts or commissions. International and regional observers are allowed broader access, lowering speculation. In this path, the damage is not erased, but it is contained. The episode becomes a stress test rather than a turning point, cited later as an example of how restraint, even if delayed, prevented deeper fracture. The worst-case scenario follows a different logic. Detention extends, communication remains restricted, and certification proceeds without meaningful contestation. Protests intensify or are preemptively suppressed, deepening polarization. In this environment, legality and legitimacy drift further apart. Even if order is maintained, it rests on force rather than acceptance, increasing the risk of future rupture. Regional actors watch closely, drawing lessons about how transitions can be managed under pressure. Across all three scenarios, one recommendation of mindset stands out. Outcomes are shaped less by final announcements than by conduct during uncertainty. Managing the space between voting and validation is decisive. Once coercion fills that space, options narrow quickly. The next months will therefore test not only political actors, but the resilience of institutions designed to absorb disagreement without breaking. The moment also reaches viewers and citizens differently, depending on where they stand. For politically engaged supporters, the episode sharpens a sense of urgency. Many feel compelled to follow updates closely, verify claims, and interpret every delay or statement as meaningful. At the same time, heightened attention comes with fatigue. Constant vigilance carries a cost, and over time, it can turn engagement into exhaustion rather than empowerment. For more cautious observers, including those without strong party alignment, the reaction is often withdrawal. When political competition appears to trigger military involvement, neutrality feels safer than participation. Conversations shift away from public spaces, and civic discussion narrows to trusted circles. This group may not endorse any side, but their silence still alters the environment by reducing the diversity of voices heard. A fair group experiences the situation primarily through practical concerns. Workers, small business owners, and families focus on stability because disruption affects daily routines. Curfews, security deployments, or rumors of unrest change travel, work hours, and access to services. Political meaning is filtered through everyday impact. In this layer, democracy is judged less by principles than by whether life feels predictable. In commentary attributed to Ibrahim Traoré, these differentiated reactions are treated as signals rather than side effects. A healthy political system absorbs disagreement without pushing citizens into fear, fatigue, or silence. When large segments of society shift behavior preemptively, it suggests that confidence has already weakened. For viewers following from outside the country, the episode can feel distant yet familiar. Many recognize similar moments elsewhere and project lessons onto their own contexts. That recognition is subtle but powerful. It shapes expectations about how disputes might unfold at home and what early warning signs to watch for. Together, these responses show that political crises do not land uniformly. They ripple through attention, behavior, and daily choices, gradually reshaping how people relate to power and to each other. Any pathway towards stabilization in this situation depends less on declarations and more on sequencing concrete steps. A first step is restoring access. Communication with detained political actors must be re-established quickly, allowing legal counsel, family contact, and public statements within defined rules. This step does not decide outcomes, but it reduces speculation and signals that institutions, not force, are steering the process. A second step involves procedural transparency. Electoral bodies can publish clear timelines, criteria, and methods for tabulation and certification, even if results remain contested. Clarity about process does not require consensus on results. It provides a shared reference point that limits rumor and helps observers distinguish delay from manipulation. The third step is proportional security management. Security forces have a role during tense periods, but visibility and mandate matter. Shifting from military assets to civilian policing where possible and clarifying chains of command lowers the psychological temperature. In the framing associated with Ibrahim Traoré, restraint here is not weakness. It is a stabilizing signal that reduces the risk of escalation without conceding authority. A fourth step is opening review channels. Courts, commissions, or independent panels can be empowered to hear challenges within fixed windows, with public updates on progress. Even if outcomes are unchanged, the act of review absorbs pressure that would otherwise spill into the streets. Finally, regional engagement can function as a buffer. Quiet facilitation by regional bodies offers face-saving options and reinforces norms without public confrontation. The measure of success is not unanimity, but de-escalation. Taken together, these steps outline a roadmap focused on timing, access, and restraint. None require rewriting laws or reversing votes. They require recognizing that legitimacy is cumulative, built through visible process rather than asserted authority. The closing emotional thread circles back to the human scene where the story began. A quiet residential compound, suddenly dark, fences torn, familiar routines interrupted. That image matters because it grounds an abstract debate in lived experience. Elections are often discussed in terms of percentages and procedures, but they are felt most sharply when ordinary spaces are disrupted. In the framing associated with Ibrahim Traoré, this disruption is the warning itself. Political power is not only tested in parliaments or courts, but in how far it intrudes into everyday life before consent is even measured. When fear enters homes before results are announced, democracy becomes fragile regardless of eventual outcomes. There is also a generational undertone. Younger citizens watching such moments learn lessons quickly, sometimes too quickly. They learn whether participation is rewarded or punished, whether patience is meaningful or naive. Those lessons linger longer than any single electoral cycle. The callback then is not to a speech or a statement, but to that initial darkness. Once lights go out early in a process, restoring illumination takes more than flipping a switch. It requires deliberate trust building, step by step. Legitimacy, once dimmed, is slow to relight. The final invitation here is not to choose sides, but to stay attentive to process. Moments like this often pass quickly in headlines, yet their lessons persist quietly. Viewers, readers, and citizens can ask better questions, not only about outcomes, but about timing, restraint, and who controls uncertainty. Those questions matter even when answers are incomplete. From the perspective articulated by Ibrahim Traoré, attention itself becomes a form of accountability. When actions taken in the dark are observed, documented, and discussed, their cost rises. Silence, by contrast, lowers that cost and normalizes repetition. Engagement does not require outrage. It requires continuity, the willingness to follow events beyond the announcement and into the aftermath. At a broader level, this episode invites reflection on what democratic transitions demand in fragile environments. Is legitimacy secured by speed, by force, or by patience? And who bears responsibility when the space between voting and validation becomes the decisive battleground? These are not questions with immediate answers. They are questions that shape future expectations. Staying with them calmly and consistently may be the most constructive response available.